Nobody picked me, the boy whispered, and Cole Hargrove, the man Boston's underworld never dared cross, the man who had buried his own son 4 years ago and sworn never to feel anything again, stopped walking. Every rule he had built around himself cracked in a single second. He turned around, he crossed the room, and he did something no one in that hall expected from a man like him. He knelt, right there on the cold floor, in front of an invisible 9-year-old boy, and said 7 words that would change both of their lives forever. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell so you never miss a story that matters. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will break your heart wide open. The Whitmore Family Foster Center held its quarterly Meet and Connect evening on the second Thursday of November, and it ran the same way it always ran. Folding chairs arranged in careful rows, cookies on white paper trays that no one touched, volunteers in laminated name badges moving through the hall with practiced smiles and quiet efficiency, and children standing on strips of yellow tape on the floor, each strip marking a place, each place marking a child waiting to be chosen. 8 children stood on those strips that evening. 7 of them were approached within the first 20 minutes. The 8th stood in the far corner of the hall, near the water fountain that dripped and clicked every 40 seconds. His name was Eli Ward. He was 9 years old, small for his age, with dirty blonde hair that fell across his forehead in a way no one had bothered to cut straight, and gray eyes that had learned to record everything and expect nothing. His green backpack hung from both shoulders. It always did. He slept with it. He ate with it within arm's reach. It was the one constant in a life that had given him no others. Families drifted past him one by one. They slowed near the other children, crouched down, opened folders, asked careful questions about hobbies and schools and whether he liked dogs. They did not slow near Eli. They glanced at his file and moved on, the way people move past a window display when they've already decided they don't need anything inside. One couple paused a full 3 feet away, looked at each other briefly, and then looked somewhere else. A woman in a green coat read the first 2 lines of his paperwork and quietly closed the folder and handed it back to the volunteer without a word. Eli watched all of it. He always did. He had learned very early that watching was safer than hoping, that measuring was safer than reaching, and that standing still inside disappointment was the one skill no one needed to teach him, because life had been a thorough and patient instructor. By 8:15, the last family had made their selections. The room was shifting, people moving toward chairs, toward paperwork, toward the end of the evening. Eli stood on his yellow strip of tape and did not move. He did not look around anymore. He simply stared at the middle distance with the expression of someone who had already filed the result and was simply waiting for the formality of departure. Then he said it, not loudly, not to anyone in particular, barely above a breath. Nobody picks me. They never do. Not a cry, not a bid for attention, a fact, delivered in the flat, weathered voice of a child who had long since stopped expecting the verdict to change. Cole Hargrove heard it from 20 feet away. He had been standing near the back wall of the hall for the better part of 40 minutes, his black overcoat buttoned, his ice blue eyes moving slowly across the room, with the habit of a man who built empires by noticing what other people missed. He hadn't spoken to anyone. He hadn't needed to. The room knew who he was. People didn't approach Cole Hargrove at Foster Center evenings. People didn't approach Cole Hargrove anywhere unless he signaled that approach was acceptable. Arthur Finch stood 3 feet to Cole's right, doing what Arthur always did, watching, calculating, preparing 3 different versions of whatever came next. Cole hadn't moved in 20 minutes. He'd arrived because Arthur had suggested it 18 months ago. In the quiet, careful way Arthur suggested things he considered important, and Cole had filed it away the way he filed away everything that required feeling something he wasn't ready to feel. Then tonight, Without explanation, without warning, something had shifted in his chest while he was sitting at his desk at 9 in the evening with a glass of bourbon and nothing in front of him but the silence of a house that used to hold sound. And he had put down the glass and said to Marcus, "Get the car." He hadn't known why. He did now. He crossed the room without hurrying, which was more alarming to the people watching than if he had moved fast. Cole Hargrove moving slowly with intention was something Boston's business world had learned to dread. The whispers came immediately and moved in a wave from the back of the hall to the front. "That's Hargrove. That's Cole Hargrove. What is he? Why is he?" He stopped in front of Eli Ward. He looked at the boy for exactly 2 seconds. Then he did something the entire room watched in stunned silence. He knelt, one knee against the cold, tiled floor, his overcoat spreading around him, and he lowered himself until his ice-blue eyes were level with the gray ones staring back at him. A woman nearby gripped her husband's arm. A volunteer took a visible step backward. Arthur Finch went very still. Eli did not run. He had learned a long time ago that running used energy he might need later, and that staying still inside a frightening moment was sometimes the smarter play. He looked at the man kneeling in front of him and said nothing. Cole held his gaze. "I heard what you said." Eli's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Cole studied the boy's face for a moment, the way the eyes tracked everything, the way the body held itself, present but angled, like a door left slightly ajar. He had seen that posture before. He had seen it in men who'd survived things they were never supposed to survive, men who learned to keep one foot pointed toward the exit at all times. "You have somewhere to be tonight," Cole said. It was not a question. Eli looked at him the way a child looks at a trick question. "No." Cole nodded slowly, as if something had been confirmed. "Then I'm not in a hurry either." Eli stared at him. For 8 seconds, neither of them spoke. The hall seemed to contract around that silence, everyone else's conversation bleeding away. Then Cole spoke again, and he said the 7 words quietly, without ceremony, without the performance of emotion, which was precisely what made them land the way they did. "I'm not here for anyone else." Eli's lips parted slightly. He closed them again. He looked down at the floor, then back up, and for one unguarded second, something crossed his face that was not quite hope. Hope was too dangerous a thing for this child to allow himself openly, but something adjacent to it, something that recognized the possibility of hope from a distance and did not immediately close the curtains. Arthur materialized at Cole's shoulder, his voice low and measured. "Cole, are you certain about this?" Cole didn't turn. His eyes stayed on Eli. "Handle the paperwork, Arthur." Arthur removed his glasses, polished them once, and said, "Right." He walked to the staff table without another word. Arthur Finch had served beside Cole Hargrove for 22 years. He knew the difference between an impulse and a decision. He had just witnessed a decision. Eli was still watching Cole. His expression had shifted from guarded to something more complicated. He said quietly, "You don't know me. My file is thick. I have problems." Cole did not flinch. "I'm not reading a file." "You should." "I should." Cole remained kneeling, unhurried. "What's the most important thing in your file?" Eli looked at him with the measuring eyes of a child who has been interrogated by adults enough times to know when a question is genuine and when it is bait. After a long moment, he said, "I've been sent back 4 times. Cole held his gaze. "I know. So why?" Cole didn't rush the answer. "Because," he said, "the problem was never you." The room around them continued its quiet movement, but Eli Ward had stopped hearing it. He was 9 years old, and he had been in 4 homes and sent back from 4 homes. And he had heard a great many things from a great many adults, and he had learned to weigh each thing carefully and trust almost none of them. He weighed what Cole Hargrove had just said. He found no seam in it, no exit ramp, no escape clause buried in the grammar. He swallowed hard and said nothing, but he didn't step back. That was enough for Cole. Across the hall, in the small private office behind the main reception desk, the center's director, Ruth Elms, sat at her desk with the door closed and her phone pressed against her ear with both hands. Her face had gone the color of old chalk. "He took him," she said. "Hargrove. He took the ward boy." The silence on the other end of the line was the kind that precedes something catastrophic, the way a city goes quiet in the seconds before a storm announces itself. Then Diane Calloway's voice came through the phone, slow and precise, each word placed like a blade finding the exact right angle. "That money, Ruth, is mine, and no one takes what's mine, not even Cole Hargrove." The line went dead. Ruth sat holding the phone long after the call ended, and she knew with the certainty of someone who has been complicit in something for too long that she had just lit the fuse on something she would not be able to stop. The Hargrove estate in Beacon Hill was 3 stories of dark brick and iron railings, warm light behind tall windows that had been burning at all hours for 4 years because Cole didn't sleep, and there was no one else to turn them on or off. From the outside, it looked like a home. From the inside, it felt like a building where time had stopped and been carefully preserved in the precise position it occupied on the worst day of its owner's life. The car stopped at the front steps. Marcus opened the rear door. Cole stepped out and waited. Eli sat in the back seat for a full 7 seconds before he moved. Cole watched him through the open door, waiting without urgency, without the impatient energy of adults who had somewhere else to be. Then the boy climbed out. He stood on the bottom step and didn't go any further. His eyes moved. Door, window, east side of the building, back garden visible through the iron gate. Cataloging, counting, not because he decided to stay, but because leaving safely required knowing every route in advance. An old habit, the oldest one he had. Cole stood beside him. He did not say, "Come in." He did not say, "Don't just stand there." He said, "When you're ready." Eli looked up at him with an expression that was almost confusion, as though the sentence had arrived in a language he'd heard of, but never spoken. No one had given him the right to choose before. Not once. In 4 homes, in every intake office, in transition meeting, and placement review, adults had moved him the way furniture gets moved, with efficiency and without consultation. He drew in a breath. He stepped inside. The marble floors, the crystal fixtures, the furniture arranged with museum precision, nothing out of place, nothing worn, nothing that suggested the easy disorder of actual living. Eli noticed all of it. He noticed the absence of photographs on the walls. He noticed the stillness, which had a specific quality different from quiet. This was not the quiet of a place at rest, but the quiet of a place holding its breath. He noticed the hallway at the top of the main staircase, and at the far end of it, a white door with a tarnished brass handle that had not been turned in long enough for the tarnish to settle deep. He noticed that Cole glanced at that door for exactly 1 second when they passed it, and then looked away with the speed of someone who had learned that looking longer cost too much. Eli said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that every house had its closed doors, and that asking about them was the fastest way to get sent somewhere else. His bedroom was at the end of the opposite hall. Large, clean, a bed dressed in white sheets, a moon-shaped nightlight on the side table, curtains pulled neatly back from a window that overlooked the back garden. The most beautiful room Eli Ward had ever been offered. He stood in the doorway and looked at it with the careful skepticism of a child who had learned that beautiful things presented to children like him always came with an expiration date printed somewhere in the fine print. "This is your room," Cole said from behind him. "No one comes in without your permission." Eli nodded. He didn't believe it, but he nodded. He waited until Cole's footsteps had faded down the hall before he crossed to the closet, opened it, took 2 coats from the hangers and folded them on the floor, set his backpack down and curled around it in the corner. He pulled the closet door to, leaving a crack of silver light from the nightlight. He closed his eyes. The bed stayed untouched. Cole walked the upper hallway at 2 in the morning because he always walked at 2 in the morning, because sleep was something that happened to other people in other lives, and he had largely made peace with that. He passed Eli's room and the door was slightly ajar, and the nightlight was on and the bed was empty. Every sheet still smooth, not a wrinkle. Cole's chest tightened in a way that was almost physical. He stepped inside. His eyes moved, not under the bed, not behind the curtains. Then he saw the closet door push to, the thread of light underneath it. He crossed the room without making a sound, stood beside the closet, and looked through the crack. Eli was asleep on the floor in the corner, his arms locked around the green backpack, his face furrowed even in sleep, his whole body angled forward with the posture of a sprinter at the start of a race who had simply forgotten to launch. Cole lowered himself against the wall beside the closet door, his back against the plaster, and looked at the half-open backpack. A piece of bread wrapped in a paper towel, a small flashlight, a folded change of clothes. Everything he needed to survive for 24 hours if the door opened and he needed to leave fast. The survival kit of a 9-year-old child. Cole did not touch it. He understood what the backpack was. It was the only thing in the world that belonged entirely to Eli Ward. The only safe thing, the one constant in a life that had given him no constants. To touch it would be to take everything. He sat against the cold wall through the rest of the night and did not sleep and did not leave. He listened to the steady rhythm of the boy's breathing, and he stayed. By morning, something in the house had shifted, though neither of them could have said precisely how. Dr. Mara Solano arrived at 9 with the composure of someone who had spent 15 years in emergency psychiatric settings and had seen enough of the worst of what people did to each other to have reached a permanent and unshakable steadiness. Arthur had called her the night before, and he had used 4 words that told her everything she needed to know about the household she was entering. Cole doesn't scare easily, which meant the man who had hired her did, and that the child at the center of the situation was the cause. She sat across from Eli in the living room for 30 minutes and said nothing. Eli sat in the chair closest to the front door, body angled slightly forward, hands gripping the edge of the seat with his knuckles white, eyes moving at steady intervals across the room in a pattern so practiced it had become unconscious. Door, window, kitchen entrance, back to Cole, who sat across the room with his ankle resting on his opposite knee and a book open in his hands that he was not reading. After the session, Mara met with Cole privately. He stood at the window. He asked, "What do you see?" She told him. She told him about the bread in the backpack. This child had been starved, not once but repeatedly over time, until his body learned that food could disappear at any moment and needed to be secured before it vanished. She told him about the flashlight. He had been locked in small, dark spaces, often enough that darkness had become dangerous, and enclosure had become the only environment where no one could reach him. She told him about the exit scanning. His nervous system had learned that staying in one place meant pain, so it had never stopped preparing to run, even when running was no longer necessary. Cole's fist closed against his thigh. His voice, when he spoke, was controlled, but barely. "How do I fix him?" Mara met his eyes without hesitation. "He isn't broken, Mr. Hargrove. He did exactly what he needed to do to stay alive. The question isn't how you fix him." She let it sit between them for a moment. "The question is whether you can teach him he doesn't have to survive anymore. Whether you have the patience to prove that staying is safe, that trust won't cost him." Cole looked out at the garden where Eli sat alone on the stone bench below, making himself small inside his own silence. "How long?" "Months," Mara said. "Maybe years. Maybe never completely. Trauma doesn't follow a schedule, and it doesn't heal on command." Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll wait." His voice was not gentle. It was something harder and more reliable than gentle. Each word placed like something structural, as long as it takes. Mara studied him. She had worked with difficult men before, Men who meant well and broke under the patience required. Men who believed they were built for endurance and discovered they were built for control, which was different. She looked at Cole Hargrove and tried to determine which kind he was. She didn't say what she was thinking, but she noted it. The real question here was not whether Eli Ward could be reached. She had seen children come back from worse. The real question was whether this man was capable of allowing himself to be healed while he was doing the healing. Whether he was strong enough to carry someone else's grief while he was still, quietly, drowning in his own. 2 weeks passed. Eli began eating at the table rather than standing near the counter, with one eye on the door. He stopped tucking food into his pockets after every meal, a behavior Mara said was among the most significant early signs of improving safety, that the body was beginning to believe food would still be there tomorrow. He still slept in the closet, but he had begun to leave the closet door open rather than pulling it shut. He didn't speak much, but he watched Cole with a quality of attention that had changed. The early fear was still present, the wariness, the reflexive measuring. But underneath it now, something else had begun to stir. Something that looked, from a careful distance, like curiosity. Then Arthur arrived on a Wednesday morning without knocking, which he never did, which meant everything. He placed a thick folder on Cole's desk and said, "We've got a problem." Cole opened the folder. Inside lay a custody petition bearing the red stamped seal of the Suffolk County Family Court, filed by one Diane Calloway. Cole looked up. "Who is she?" Arthur sat, removed his glasses, polished them. Eli's stepmother. She married the boy's father, James Ward, 7 years ago. James died in a car accident when Eli was 3. Diane was granted temporary custody and placed the boy in the foster system 18 months later. Cole frowned. She gave him up and kept custody. Technically, she retained legal guardianship while placing him in state care. Arthur produced another document, slid it forward. James Ward left a trust fund for Eli. $8,000 per month transferred to the legal guardian until the boy turns 18 or is formally adopted. At which point, the money moves, Cole said, into a restricted account solely in Eli's name. Diane loses access completely. The silence in the room had weight. Cole stared at the bank statements Arthur had highlighted in yellow. 48 payments, 4 years, $384,000. Into Diane Calloway's accounts, while a boy hid bread in a backpack, while he slept on closet floors with a flashlight because someone had locked him in the dark enough times to make enclosure feel like safety. Cole's voice was very quiet. "She doesn't want the boy." Arthur nodded. "She wants his money. She'll fight the adoption with everything she has. She has already retained counsel." Cole stood. He walked to the window. Boston stretched below him in the November gray, his city, his kingdom, the place where his name still opened doors and closed mouths and meant something specific and serious in rooms where those things mattered. He allowed himself one cold, precise smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes and wasn't meant to. "She wants a war," he said. "Fine." He turned back to Arthur. "I've never lost one." He told Arthur to dig everything on Diane Calloway, every account, every debt, every relationship, every person who had signed paperwork or looked the other way while a 9-year-old boy circled the foster system 4 times and came back smaller each time. "Find me who helped her. Find me who got paid. Find me the whole structure of it." Arthur nodded and moved toward the door. Cole's voice stopped him. "Arthur." The older man turned. "No one touches my boy," Cole said. His voice was low, the way a sound is low when it is carrying a very large amount of weight. "No one." Arthur held his gaze for a long moment. Then he inclined his head. He had stood beside Cole Hargrove through enough to know the specific frequency of that voice and what it meant when Cole used it. That was not a threat. Threats were preliminary. That was something Cole only said when the decision had already been made and the thing was already in motion. That was a declaration. He left without another word. Cole stood alone in his study for a long time after. Then he walked down the hall, leaned against the doorframe of the living room, and looked in. Eli sat cross-legged on the rug near the far window, his green backpack beside him, turning a small object over and over in his hands. A worn metal compass, the kind a child carries because it was his father's, and it is the last thing that connects him to the person who was supposed to keep him safe. He didn't know Cole was watching. His face, in that unguarded moment, was simply a child's face, open and tired and impossibly young. Cole looked at him for a long time. Then he straightened, went to the kitchen, and made 2 cups of hot chocolate. He hadn't made hot chocolate in 4 years. He'd forgotten they even had the ingredients until he found them at the back of the cabinet, behind the bourbon, behind the coffee, in a place where things get pushed when you are trying not to think about the person who liked them. He walked back to the living room and set 1 mug on the table beside Eli without saying anything. Eli looked up. He looked at the mug. He looked at Cole. He looked at the mug again. Cole sat in the armchair across from him, picked up his own mug, and opened his book. Eli reached out slowly, wrapped both hands around the mug, brought it close. Steam rose against his chin. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. What he did instead was something simpler and more significant. He exhaled. A long, slow breath, the kind a body releases when it has been held tightly against something for so long that the release is almost involuntary. And then he turned the compass over in his palm 1 more time and set it down on the rug beside him, and he didn't pick it up again that evening. He stayed. Cole turned a page and did not allow himself to look up, because if he had, the boy would have seen what was in his face. And the boy was not ready for that yet, and neither, if he was honest, was he. Outside, the November dark settled over Boston like a held breath. Inside the house, for the first time in a very long time, 2 people sat in the same room without either of them preparing to leave. 3 days passed before Eli spoke voluntarily at the dinner table. Not much, 2 words. Cole had set down a plate of eggs and toast. Simple, nothing complicated. Mara had told him that unfamiliar food sometimes triggered anxiety in children who'd gone hungry. And Eli had looked at it, then looked up and said, "Thank you." Flat, careful, like someone testing the weight of a bridge before committing a single step. Cole said, "You're welcome," and went back to his coffee. He didn't make a production of it. He didn't smile too wide or say anything about progress or tell Eli how much it meant. He understood instinctively that for a child who had been managed by adults his entire life, praised strategically, rewarded conditionally, handled the way you handle something you need to keep functional, the absence of reaction was itself a gift. He was simply a man eating breakfast across from a boy eating breakfast, and neither of them needed it to be more than that yet. What Cole didn't say at that table, what he carried out of the kitchen and up to his study and held privately, was that 2 words from Eli Ward felt like more than most things people had said to him in years. Mara came every morning at 9. She never rushed Eli. She brought a deck of cards on the 4th day and asked if he knew any games, and Eli said he knew war, and she said she did too. And they played 3 rounds without discussing anything psychological at all, which was, she told Cole afterward, exactly the point. He needs to experience adults as people first, she said, not as professionals assigned to fix him. Cole asked if that was working. Mara looked at him steadily. "He beat me twice. I'd say yes." The nights were harder. Cole still walked the hall at 2. He had stopped pretending he was going to sleep before then. On the 5th night, he passed Eli's door and heard something. Not a scream, not crying, something quieter and in some ways worse. A low, steady sound, barely audible, the kind of sound a person makes when they are trying very hard not to make any sound at all. He stopped outside the door. He didn't go in. He stood in the hallway with his hand flat against the wall and listened. And after a few minutes, the sound stopped, and he heard the faint rustle of the closet door being pulled shut, and then silence. He stood there for another 10 minutes before he walked back downstairs. He called Mara at 7 in the morning. She answered on the second ring. He told her what he'd heard. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't go in unless he comes to you. He needs to know the door is his, that the choice is his. If you enter when he hasn't asked, you become another adult who decides when his space belongs to him and when it doesn't." Cole was quiet. Then, "That's hard to sit with." "I know," Mara said. "That's what makes it the right call." On the seventh night, Eli came out on his own. Cole was in the living room at 2:15 with a book he wasn't reading and a lamp burning low when he heard the soft, careful footsteps on the stairs. He didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the page. He heard Eli stop at the entrance to the room. He heard the boy stand there, measuring, calculating, deciding. Cole turned a page. Eli came inside. He crossed to the far end of the sofa, the maximum distance from Cole, while still being in the same room, and sat down with his pillow pressed against his chest and his feet tucked under him. He didn't speak. He stared at the middle distance. Cole kept reading, or kept holding the book, which was close enough. 20 minutes passed without a word. Then Eli said quietly, "You don't sleep." Cole glanced up briefly, then back to the page. "Not much." "Why?" Cole closed the book. He looked at the window for a moment. "Because when I sleep, I dream about what I've lost." He said it simply, without self-pity, without the performance of grief, just the fact of it. Silence. Then Eli, even more quietly, "Me too." Neither of them said anything after that. The old clock in the corner ticked. The lamp burned. And two people who had both learned to carry their losses alone sat in the same room and let the silence hold them both, without demanding anything from either of them. An hour later, Cole heard the change in Eli's breathing. He looked over. The boy had slipped sideways against the arm of the sofa, eyes closed, pillow still clutched against his chest, face finally smooth. No furrow in the brow, no tension in the jaw. He was sleeping outside the closet for the first time. Cole rose without a sound, retrieved the wool blanket from the armchair, and brought it back. He stood over the boy for a moment. Then he bent and laid it carefully over him, and his hand trembled at the edge of the fabric in a way he didn't try to stop. 4 years since he had done this. 4 years since there had been anyone to do it for. He stayed crouched there beside the sofa longer than necessary. Then he straightened and returned to his chair and sat through the rest of the night watching the boy sleep, the book forgotten on the cushion beside him. Arthur arrived the next morning with the expression he reserved for things that couldn't be undone. He waited until Eli was in the back garden with Mara before he sat down across from Cole and opened the second folder. Cole recognized the look and felt something brace inside him before a word was spoken. "It's worse than we thought," Arthur said. He laid the documents out in sequence. The Child Protective Services file from 14 months ago, the one marked "Lost in the System," had been recovered through a private channel Arthur declined to name. Cole read it carefully. Eli's intake weight, the clinical language describing severe undernourishment, the interviewer's notes, extreme fear responses, reluctance to discuss home environment, repeated flinching during physical assessment. The case had been formally opened on a Friday and marked closed and misfiled by the following Wednesday. Cole looked up. Files don't lose themselves. Arthur pushed forward the next document. Ruth Elms, director of the Whitmore Center. Payments from accounts linked to Diane Calloway. $5,000 here, $3,000 there, spread across 4 years in amounts small enough to avoid scrutiny. $41,000 total. Paid to maintain the guardianship structure. Paid to keep the paperwork simple. Paid to make sure no adoption ever processed clean enough to trigger the trust account transfer. Cole set the document down on the desk with a care that was more frightening than if he'd thrown it. His voice was very controlled. "She paid someone to lose the file." Arthur nodded. While the boy was being documented as severely underweight. Arthur nodded again. Cole stood and walked to the window. He stood with his back to Arthur for a long time. When he turned around, his face had gone to the particular stillness that people who had worked with him long enough knew meant the calculation was complete and the decision was already made, and everything from this point forward was simply execution. "Find me Eleanor. Find me Ruth," he said. "Bring her in." Quietly. Arthur rose. He was already moving toward the door when Cole said, "Arthur?" The older man stopped. "I want every name, every signature on every document that let this happen. Every person who looked at that boy's file and made a choice to protect her income over his life. I want all of them." Arthur said, "Understood," and left. Cole stood alone for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and sent a single message to Marcus. "Nobody comes near this house tonight. Nobody." That evening, Diane Calloway appeared on the 6 o'clock news. A housekeeper had left the television on in the kitchen. Eli came down the back stairs at 6:15, heading for the table, and heard the voice before he reached the doorway. He stopped walking. His hand found the wall beside him. On the screen, Diane sat in a pale cream dress, her hair pinned soft, her eyes red-rimmed with what had been applied rather than felt. She spoke of sacrifice, of a mother's grief, of a woman shattered by loss who had made a painful decision and never stopped regretting it. She spoke of love. She used that word 4 times in 90 seconds. Then she said Eli's name, and the sound of it in her mouth made the boy's knuckles go white against the wall. "I have never stopped fighting for my son," Diane said to the camera. Eli stepped into the kitchen doorway and stood in front of the television and did not move. His face was absolutely still. Not the stillness of someone who felt nothing, the stillness of someone who felt everything and had learned to contain it completely because expressing it had never once been safe. Cole entered the kitchen from the opposite side, took one look at Eli's face, one look at the screen, and crossed to the counter and turned the television off. The kitchen went quiet. Eli stared at the blank screen for a long moment. Then he said without turning, "She's lying." "I know," Cole said. "She never said those things to me. Not once." Eli's voice was flat and precise, each word stripped of everything except the bare fact of it. "She said other things. She said I was expensive. She said I was the reason she couldn't afford things. She said—" He stopped. His hand dropped from the wall. "She never said my name like that. Not ever." Cole stood still and let the silence hold the words. He didn't rush to fill it. "She just wants the money," Eli said. "That's all I ever was to her." Cole moved then. He crossed the kitchen and stood beside the boy, and he placed his hand on Eli's shoulder. Steady, no pressure, the way you brace something without gripping it. Eli didn't pull away. He stood under the weight of the hand and breathed. "Liars lose, Eli," Cole said. "Maybe not today, but always. In the end, always." Eli looked up at him. His gray eyes were dry, but something in them had cracked slightly, the careful blankness giving way to something rawer underneath. "Do you promise?" Cole held his gaze. "In my world? Yes, I promise." Eli looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned back to the blank screen. Then he said quietly, "What is she going to do?" Cole tightened his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. "She's going to try to take you back." Eli was quiet. Then, "Can she?" "No," Cole said. The word landed with the finality of something structural. "She cannot." Eli exhaled slowly through his nose. The tension in his shoulders did not fully release, but something shifted underneath it. Some small weight redistributed. He went to the table and sat down and ate his dinner without another word. Cole sat across from him and ate his own, and Marcus stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall like a mountain that had decided it lived there now, and no one said anything for the rest of the meal. And somehow the silence was entirely different from the kind that had filled this house a week ago. That night after Eli had gone upstairs, Cole sat in his study for a long time without moving. Arthur had texted him, "Ruth Elms will meet tomorrow. Private location. She's scared." Cole typed back 2 words, "Good. Let her be." He sat in the quiet of the house and listened to the sound of a child's footsteps crossing the upper hallway and the soft click of a bedroom door being pulled shut. He had not heard that sound in 4 years. He had forgotten what it did to him. That specific, ordinary sound, a child going to bed in a house where someone was still awake downstairs. That unconscious expression of safety. That I don't need to guard the door because someone else is watching. He sat with it longer than he should have. Then he closed the folder on his desk and went upstairs. He passed Eli's door. It was closed, not pulled fully shut. A sliver of silver light from the moon-shaped nightlight bled beneath it into the dark hallway. Cole stopped. He stood outside the door and listened. Steady breathing. No furrowing, no tension audible in the rhythm of it. He leaned one shoulder against the wall beside the door and stayed there for a moment, the way he had stayed beside the closet that first night. Not because it was necessary, but because the alternative, walking away and leaving that thin thread of light unattended, was something he found he was no longer willing to do. He pushed off the wall and went to his own room for the first time in a week. He lay down on the bed without undressing. He stared at the ceiling. He did not sleep, but that was fine. Somewhere in the next room, a boy was breathing steadily in a space that was finally beginning to feel, to both of them, like something that might eventually become a home. Outside, Boston moved through its November dark. Inside, for the second night in a row, neither of them were alone. Ruth Elms arrived at Arthur's office building on a Tuesday morning, looking like someone who hadn't slept in 4 days, which was accurate. She sat across from Cole in a room with no windows and held her coffee cup with both hands and did not drink from it. Her eyes moved to the door twice in the first minute. Old habit, Cole recognized it. He'd seen it in Eli. He let the silence run long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he said, "Tell me about the file." Ruth set the cup down. Her hands stayed wrapped around it. "I didn't create the problem," she said. I maintained it." "You buried a documented neglect case," Cole said. The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. "You took money to make sure a 9-year-old boy stayed exactly where he was, cycling through placements, getting sent back, while Diane Calloway collected his father's money and called it guardianship." Ruth's jaw tightened. She said, "I was helping him." She said the system was better than... She stopped. "Better than what?" Cole said. Ruth looked at the table. She didn't finish the sentence. Cole leaned forward slightly. "I need you on the stand. I need you to tell the court exactly what you told me. Every payment, every conversation, every document you touched." Ruth looked up sharply. "If I testify against Diane, she'll destroy me. You don't know what she's capable of. And you don't know what I'm capable of," Cole said, his voice dropping just enough. "But you've heard." He paused and let that land. "I'm offering you protection. What Diane is offering you is the chance to go down with her when this breaks open. And it will break open, Ruth. The only question is which side of it you're standing on." Ruth pressed her lips together. She looked at the door again, then she looked back at Cole, and something in her face shifted. Not courage exactly, but the particular resolution of someone who has been afraid for so long that they've finally calculated the cost of staying afraid and found it higher than the alternative. "All right," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "All right." Cole sat back. Arthur, who had been silent against the far wall, opened his notepad without a word. The media campaign started the same week, which told Cole that Diane had been preparing it in parallel. She wasn't improvising. She had planned for this contingency, which meant she had always known the adoption could happen and had built her counteroffensive in advance. That precision made her more dangerous than he had estimated. Headline after headline flooded the Boston papers and the local news cycle. "Underworld figure seeks custody of orphan. Crime lord as father. Who approved this? Boston's most feared man and the little boy caught in the middle. Old photographs surfaced. Cole outside a warehouse 3 years ago. Cole stepping into a car beside a man whose name appeared in federal filings that had never produced charges. Cole at a table in a restaurant with people whose faces the caption implied were significant. No proof, no charges, just images and the suggestion of images, which in a family court proceeding was sometimes enough. Cole read every story. He didn't show them to Eli. He didn't need to. What he did do was have Marcus remove every newspaper from the house, disable the household's access to the local news channels, and tell the housekeeper, Mrs. Garland, in terms that left no ambiguity, that anything resembling media coverage of any kind did not enter through the front door. Mrs. Garland had worked for the Hargrove family for 11 years. She said, "Of course, Mr. Hargrove," and meant it. Eli noticed anyway. He was 9 years old, not oblivious. He noticed the newspapers disappearing. He noticed the way Mrs. Garland moved around certain topics at breakfast, the way you move around furniture in a dark room, carefully, with deliberate avoidance. He noticed that Marcus had started doing a perimeter check of the property twice daily instead of once. He came to Cole's study on a Thursday afternoon and stood in the doorway until Cole looked up. Then he said, "She's doing something, isn't she?" Cole put down his pen. He didn't insult the boy by denying it. "She's making noise," he said. "That's what people do when they're losing and they know it." Eli thought about that. What kind of noise? The kind meant to make other people think, "I'm not the right choice for you." Is it working? Cole looked at him directly. No. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you know?" "Because the judge decides, not the newspaper." Cole held the boy's gaze. "And I have something Diane Calloway will never have." "What?" "The truth." Cole said it without theater, just the bare weight of it. She's built her whole case on performance, the grieving mother, the sacrificial love. But every piece of paper in that courtroom tells a different story. And paper doesn't perform. Eli studied him for a long moment, with those gray eyes that missed nothing. Then he nodded once, with the precise economy of a child who has learned not to waste trust, but has decided, carefully, to extend a measure of it. He left the doorway without another word. Cole sat still for a moment after he was gone. Then he picked up his phone and called Margaret Lynn. "We go in 10 days, he said when she answered. "I want everything airtight, every document, every witness, every line of testimony. Nothing improvised, nothing that gives them room to breathe." Margaret said, "I've been ready for a week, Cole." He almost smiled. "I know, that's why I hired you." 8 days before the hearing, the second major piece fell into place, and it was worse than even Arthur had prepared him for. Cole was in his study at 11 at night when Arthur came in. He had a single document in his hand, and he set it on Cole's desk and said, "Read the section I've highlighted." Cole read it. His face did not change. The hand holding the document went very still. He read it twice. Then he set it down and said, "When?" Arthur said, 2 years ago, while Eli was in his third placement. Diane filed an emergency medical waiver on his behalf, citing instability of placement as grounds for restricting certain therapeutic interventions. It blocked 2 separate referrals from the Department of Children and Families to outside trauma specialists, which means she deliberately blocked him from getting help, Cole said. While collecting the money, Arthur confirmed, she wasn't just indifferent to his well-being. She was actively managing it, making sure he stayed difficult enough to keep cycling through placements, which kept the guardianship intact, which kept the payments flowing. Cole pushed back from the desk and stood. He walked to the window. The city below him moved through its ordinary Thursday night without any awareness of what had just been said in this room. She engineered it, Cole said. She didn't just neglect him, she engineered his damage to protect her income. Arthur said nothing. There was nothing to add. Cole stood at the window for a long time. When he turned around, his face had the quality it had in the moments before he made decisions that could not be walked back. He said, "Get this to Margaret tonight. I want it introduced first, before anything else." "Done," Arthur said, and he left. Cole went upstairs. He stood outside Eli's door. He could hear the nightlight humming faintly. He pressed his back against the wall and stood in the dark hallway and breathed, slowly and deliberately, the way he taught himself to breathe through anger in the years when anger had almost destroyed him. Then something happened that he had not expected. The door opened. Eli stood there in his oversized pajamas, his hair flat on one side, his eyes alert with the specific alertness of a child whose nervous system had never fully learned the difference between sleeping and watching. He looked at Cole standing against the wall in the dark hallway and said, without accusation, "Are you doing the thing where you stand outside my door?" Cole exhaled. "Yes." Eli considered this. "Why don't you just come in?" Cole looked at him. "Because it's your room. You said so yourself. No one comes in without your permission." Something moved across Eli's face, something complicated and quick. Then he stepped back from the doorway and held the door open and said, "You can come in." Cole came in. He sat in the chair beside the window, not the edge of the bed, not too close. Eli climbed back under the blanket and pulled it up and lay on his back looking at the ceiling. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Eli said, "Dad." The word came out entirely naturally without hesitation or ceremony or any apparent awareness of what it cost to say, as if it had been there all along, waiting for a moment quiet enough to slip through. Cole went very still. Eli hadn't seemed to notice what he'd said. He kept his eyes on the ceiling. "Can you tell me about Daniel?" The room was quiet. The nightlight hummed. Cole's hands rested on his knees, and he looked at the boy and felt something open in his chest that had been sealed for 4 years. "He was 6, Cole said. His voice came out lower than he intended. He was stubborn. He laughed at his own jokes before he finished them. He had this thing he did in the morning where he'd stand at the top of the stairs and yell my name until I came out of the bedroom. And when I did, he'd say, 'Good morning,' like he'd just accomplished something important." Eli smiled. A small, real smile, barely there but present. "That sounds like something I'd do." Cole looked at him. "Yeah, it does." Silence. Then Eli, carefully, "What happened to him?" Cole had told this story once in court. He had said the words in a room full of strangers with cameras and reporters, and a woman across the aisle who was performing grief. This was different. This was a child in the dark asking a father to tell the truth. "Men who wanted to hurt me," Cole said. "They took him to get to me. By the time I found him, it was too late." He paused. "I couldn't save him. That never leaves." Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned his head and looked at Cole directly. "Is that why you don't sleep?" Cole held his gaze. "Yes." Eli nodded slowly, as if something had been confirmed. Then he said, with the blunt logic of a child who has processed adult grief and arrived at a conclusion, "I think he'd want you to sleep." Cole looked at him. Eli shrugged slightly under the blanket. "I'm just saying, if he was like that, laughing at his own jokes, doing the morning thing, he sounds like someone who'd hate knowing you were up all night." Cole said nothing for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Yeah, he probably would." Eli looked back at the ceiling. "I'm glad you're here," he said. His voice was matter-of-fact, not performed. "I know I didn't say it before, but I am." Cole sat in the chair beside the window in the room where a boy had stopped sleeping in a closet, and he let those words sit inside him, and he did not trust himself to speak for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad I'm here too, Eli." He meant it in a way he hadn't meant anything in 4 years. Eli closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing had steadied into sleep. Cole didn't leave. He sat in the chair and watched the boy sleep, and thought about Daniel, and thought about the courtroom in 9 days, and thought about Ruth Elms and Margaret Lynn, and the document Arthur had brought in tonight. and he held all of it, and underneath all of it, louder than any of it, was the sound of Eli's voice saying, "Dad," without knowing what it meant. He sat there until 3 in the morning. Then his phone vibrated on his knee. A message from Arthur. One line. Diane's attorney just filed a motion to expedite. She wants the hearing moved to Friday. Cole read it twice. Then he typed back, "Letter, we're ready." He set the phone down and looked at Eli, still sleeping, still smooth in the face, still breathing in that steady, unguarded rhythm that meant the night was holding him gently for once. He's ready too, Cole thought. He just doesn't know it yet. He stood, laid the blanket edge more securely over the boy's shoulder, and walked to the door. He paused in the doorway and looked back at the room. The nightlight, the green backpack on the floor beside the bed, no longer strapped to Eli's shoulders, just resting there. The compass on the nightstand, Eli's father's compass, sitting open beside the lamp. Cole turned off the hall light and went downstairs and sat at his desk and began reviewing Margaret's case files, one by one, through the rest of the night. Outside, Boston moved through its dark. Inside this house, a man who had not fought for anything personal in 4 years was preparing for the most important battle of his life. Friday arrived the way important days always do, without ceremony, without warning in the quality of the light or the temperature of the air, just an ordinary morning that happened to contain something that would determine the rest of a child's life. Cole was dressed at 5:30. He hadn't slept. He sat at his desk until 6, then went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the counter and drank it standing up because sitting felt impossible. Marcus came in at 6:15, checked the perimeter out of habit, and poured himself a cup without being invited. He leaned against the counter beside Cole and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. 20 years of working beside this man had given Marcus a fluency in Cole's silences that most people never achieved with words. At 6:45, there were footsteps on the stairs. Both men looked up. Eli came into the kitchen in his good clothes, the dark pants and gray sweater Mrs. Garland had pressed the night before and laid out on the chair in his room. His hair was combed. His green backpack was not on his shoulders, which Cole noted and did not remark on. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Cole and said, "I'm ready." Cole looked at him for a moment. "Okay," he said, "let's go." Eli crossed to the counter, poured himself a glass of orange juice, drank half of it in one go, and set the glass down. Then he looked at Marcus. "You're coming." Marcus said, "Where else would I be?" Eli almost smiled. Then he said to Cole quietly, "What do I do if I see her?" Cole turned to face him fully. "You do nothing. You look at me, that's all." Eli nodded. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were steady. "Okay." Cole put his hand briefly on the back of the boy's neck. Not gripping, just present, a second of contact, and then released. "Let's move," he said. Suffolk County Family Courthouse on Cambridge Street was not built to contain the kind of attention it received that Friday morning. Reporters had been there since 7. 3 cameras were set up on the sidewalk, 2 more inside the lobby, which the bailiffs were in the process of removing when Cole's car arrived. Arthur met them at the side entrance with Margaret Lynn, who was already in full motion, talking on her phone, reading a document, and walking in heels on a wet sidewalk simultaneously, none of which appeared to require her concentration. She ended her call when she saw Cole. She said, "Ruth is inside. She's holding." Gerald Price filed 2 last-minute motions this morning, both denied. Judge Calloway, she stopped. Judge Harmon, her jaw tightened slightly. Calloway is in your head. Judge Harmon has read the full file, and he is not a man who responds well to performance. Cole said, "And the new document, the medical waiver." Margaret's expression shifted into something precise and cold. "That is my opening." She looked at Eli for one moment, then she said to Cole, "He shouldn't hear all of it." Cole glanced at Eli. The boy was already looking at him. Cole said, "You're going to sit with Marcus in the gallery. You're not going to hear everything that gets said in there today, And I need you to trust me that what you don't hear is because I'm protecting you, not hiding anything." Eli held his gaze. He thought about it, really thought, the way he did everything, carefully, with the calculation of a child who had been given reasons not to trust that always turned out to be lies. Then he said, "Okay." His voice was quiet but not uncertain. "I trust you." Cole held that for exactly 1 second. Then he said, "Good. Stay with Marcus. No matter what you hear, stay with Marcus and look at me." They went inside. The courtroom had the particular quality of rooms where important things happen badly, fluorescent and serious and entirely indifferent to the people inside it. Diane Calloway was already seated at the petitioner's table when Cole entered. She was wearing the pale cream dress again. Her attorney, Gerald Price, was a compact man in his 50s with a very expensive haircut and the practiced confidence of someone who had won difficult cases by controlling the emotional temperature of a room. He glanced at Cole entering and allowed himself a small, confident adjustment of his collar. Cole didn't look at him. He sat beside Margaret, took out his phone, turned it face down, and folded his hands on the table. Diane looked at Cole from across the room. Her eyes were professionally red-rimmed. She let her gaze travel briefly to the gallery, where Eli sat between Marcus and Arthur, and something crossed her face. Not maternal feeling, nothing soft, just the quick calculation of someone assessing a variable. Then she turned away. Eli watched her and did not look away. His face was completely still. Judge Harmon entered at 9 sharp, a silver-haired man in his mid-60s who moved with the unhurried authority of someone who had presided over enough human catastrophe to have reached a permanent and unshakable practicality about it. He took his seat, reviewed something on the bench, and said without preamble, "We're here on the petition of Diane Calloway, contesting the pending adoption of one Eli Ward by Cole Hargrove." He looked up. "Let's proceed without theater. Mr. Price?" Gerald rose. He was smooth. He was practiced. He opened with grief, Diane's grief, the impossible weight of loss, a woman shattered by widowhood who had made an agonizing choice to place her son in a system she believed would care for him while she found her footing. He spoke of love and sacrifice and the fundamental bond between a mother and child that no court order could ethically sever. He spoke of Cole's associations, carefully, without direct accusation, letting the implication do the work. "A man like Mr. Hargrove," he said, with a kind of pause that made the phrase do double duty. The gallery murmured. Then he called Diane to the stand. She was extraordinary at it. Cole had to admit that privately, without any warmth. She had constructed the performance with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every beat. Her voice broke in exactly the right places. Her pauses were exactly long enough to let the jury feel the weight of them. She spoke of Eli's name with a tenderness that would have been convincing to anyone who hadn't seen the boy's intake weight on a clinical document. When she said, "I never stopped loving my son," she pressed one hand to her chest and her eyes filled, and an older woman in the gallery made a soft sound. Cole sat still and watched her and kept his face at rest and waited. Then Margaret rose. She thanked Diane for her testimony in a tone that contained no actual gratitude, and she placed a document before the judge and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit 1. This is the Department of Children and Families investigation report from 14 months ago. The one filed under case number 2023-W-4471. The one marked as lost in the system 11 days after it was open." Gerald was on his feet instantly. "Objection! That document was not disclosed in pretrial." Judge Harmon raised one hand. He looked at Margaret. "Counsel, I received this in my pretrial file at 6:15 this morning." He looked at Gerald. "Your objection is noted and overruled." He looked at Margaret. "Proceed." Diane's composure developed its first visible fracture. Her hands, folded neatly on the stand, tightened against each other. Margaret read from the report with the careful precision of someone who had decided that clinical language was more devastating than outrage. Eli Ward, age 8. Intake weight, 17% below average for height and age. Clinical notation. Signs consistent with chronic undernourishment. Interview notation. Extreme fear responses. Reluctance to discuss home environment. Repeated flinching during standard physical assessment. She set the document down. Then she produced the second document. This is a medical waiver filed by Diane Calloway 2 years ago, citing placement instability. It blocked 2 separate referrals to outside trauma specialists for Eli Ward. She let that sit for 3 full seconds. "Miss Calloway," she said, turning to the stand with a tone that was perfectly polite and completely merciless, "you filed this waiver on the same week that the DCF caseworker recommended a therapeutic intervention assessment. Can you explain why a legal guardian who claimed to love her child would block access to trauma care?" Diane opened her mouth, closed it. Gerald said, "Objection, calls for." Judge Harmon said, "Overruled." "Answer the question, Miss Calloway." Diane said, "I was concerned about the disruption to his routine." Margaret said, "His routine." She did not raise her voice. She said it with the flat clarity of someone placing a fact on a surface and stepping back so everyone could see it. "He was cycling through his 4th placement in 18 months, Miss Calloway. What routine are you referring to?" The gallery stirred. The older woman who had made the sympathetic sound was no longer making sounds. Then Margaret called Ruth Elms. Ruth came to the stand looking like someone walking to the edge of a cliff. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly when she placed them on the rail. She looked once at Diane, and then looked deliberately away and did not look at her again. Margaret led her through it methodically. The payments, amounts, dates, account origins. $41,000 over 4 years. The closed file. The conversations in which Diane had used the word maintaining. The specific instruction, delivered twice, that the Ward case should stay simple. Ruth's voice was not strong, but it was clear. Every word landed. Diane's attorney objected 4 times. All 4 were overruled. When Margaret asked, "Did you believe at the time that Eli Ward was safe?" Ruth stopped. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes went to the gallery, to the boy sitting between Marcus and the older man with wire-rimmed glasses. The boy with the gray eyes who was watching her without hatred, without accusation, with the particular quality of attention of someone who has been waiting a very long time to simply be seen. Ruth looked at him for a moment, then she looked at her hands. "No," she said, "I didn't." Her voice broke on the last word. "I told myself I did, but I didn't." Margaret said, "No further questions." The courtroom was very quiet. Then Margaret said, "We call Cole Hargrove." Cole walked to the stand with the measured pace of a man who had decided that the only thing that mattered in the next 10 minutes was truth, and that truth did not require performance or volume or anything except being said clearly and without flinching. Gerald came at him as expected. The associations, the reputation, the nature of his business interests. Cole answered everything without evasion and without apology. Real estate, investments, documented, taxed. When Gerald said, "There are people who would say your world is not a safe one for a child," Cole said, "There are people who would say many things. What the record shows is a boy who arrived at my home underweight, unable to sleep in a bed, hiding food in a backpack, afraid of the dark because someone used the dark as a punishment." He looked at Gerald directly. "That didn't happen in my world." Gerald paused. He shifted his papers. Then he said, "Mr. Hargrove, you've spoken of your commitment to this boy, but you have no parenting experience. You've never raised a child. How can this court be confident that you're capable of providing what Eli Ward needs?" Cole said, "I raised a son." Gerald had not expected that. He said, "Excuse me?" Cole said it again, the same way without hurry. I raised a son. His name was Daniel. He was 6 years old. He stopped. In the gallery, Eli had gone completely still. His eyes were on Cole with an intensity that Marcus noticed and said nothing about. Cole continued, 4 years ago, men who wanted to leverage me took my son. By the time I found him, it was too late. He looked down at his hands for a moment. He looked back up. I could not save him, and that has not left me for a single day. The courtroom was perfectly silent, not a page turning, not a chair shifting, not a breath taken loudly. Gerald Price stood at his table, and for the first time in his professional life, appeared to have run out of angles. Cole looked at Judge Harmon. He said, I am not a perfect man. I have made choices I cannot take back. But I ask this court to measure me by one thing only, what I am willing to do for that boy. He did not look at the gallery. He didn't need to. The answer is everything. All of it, for as long as I breathe. Harmon looked at him for a long time. His expression gave nothing away, which was the expression of a man who had already made a decision and was simply completing the formality of letting everyone else arrive at it. Cole stepped down and returned to his seat. Margaret leaned toward him and said quietly, That's it. We have it. Cole said nothing. He was looking at the gallery, at Eli, who was looking back at him with gray eyes that were bright and wet at the edges and absolutely steady. The boy lifted his chin very slightly, the way Cole had seen him do when he was holding something together through will alone. Cole gave him a single nod. Then Judge Harmon spoke. He worked through the evidence methodically, as the court required, but the conclusion was never in doubt. He named the payments. He named the blocked referrals. He named the buried file and the $41,000 and the monthly trust payments flowing into accounts while a child's intake weight was noted as 17% below average. He said, That is not love. That is the systematic exploitation of a child for financial gain. He looked at Diane Calloway without expression. I want to be very precise about that characterization. It is not a harsh reading of ambiguous evidence. It is what the evidence shows. He turned to Cole. This court does not adjudicate reputation. It adjudicates evidence and the best interest of the child. What the evidence shows is a man who has provided safety, consistency, and demonstrable healing to a child in a matter of weeks. He raised the gavel. Permanent custody is granted to Cole Hargrove. Adoption proceedings may continue without legal impediment from Miss Calloway. Furthermore, this court is referring the financial conduct of the former guardianship arrangement to the district attorney's office for review. The gavel came down and Diane Calloway stood up. Everything she had constructed, the dress, the reddened eyes, the measured, trembling voice, the performance of sacrifice and love, collapsed in one moment. She stood and her voice came out raw and stripped of everything except what had always been underneath it. That money is mine, she said. I spent 4 years on that brat and I am entitled to every cent of it. The courtroom froze. Gerald seized her arm. Your Honor, my client, Judge Harmon said. Remove your client from my courtroom, Mr. Price. Right now. Diane was still talking as Gerald pulled her toward the door, her voice rising, losing its shape entirely. The word brat hanging in the air of the room like something that had been true all along and had simply been waiting for the right moment to say itself out loud. Then the door closed behind her. Cole sat absolutely still for a moment. Then he exhaled one long, slow breath, and he stood and turned toward the gallery and found Eli's face immediately. The boy was standing. Marcus had a hand on his shoulder, not restraining, just present. Eli's face was wet. He wasn't making a sound. He was just standing there with his gray eyes on Cole and his hands at his sides and his chest rising and falling with the effort of containing something too large for a 9-year-old body. Cole crossed the room. He walked past reporters, past Gerald Price in his briefcase, past Arthur, who put a hand briefly on his arm as he passed and said simply, "Go." He stopped in front of Eli. He did not kneel this time. He simply stood in front of the boy and looked at him and said, "Let's go home." Eli reached out and took his hand. Cole looked down at the small hand wrapped around his fingers. He felt something move through him that had no name and needed none. Then he closed his hand around Eli's, and they walked out together. And Marcus fell in behind them, and the cameras outside got their shot, but what they captured was nothing like what they had come to film. What they got was a man and a boy walking out of a courthouse holding hands in the ordinary, unhurried way of people who know exactly where they are going. Home. Both of them, finally, going home. The ride home from the courthouse was quiet, not the old quiet, not the museum silence of a house where time had stopped, but something different, something that had texture and warmth, the quiet of two people who have just been through something enormous together and don't need to fill it with words yet. Eli sat beside Cole in the back seat with his seatbelt on, and his hands in his lap, and his eyes on the window, watching Boston move past. Halfway home, he said without turning, "Is it real?" Cole said, "Yes." Eli nodded slowly, absorbing it, the way he absorbed everything, carefully, without rushing, testing the weight of it before committing. Then he said, "She called me a brat." His voice was even, but Cole heard what was underneath it. He said, "She showed the court exactly who she is." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "She showed me too. A long time ago. I just didn't think anyone else would ever see it." Cole looked at him. "Now they have," he said. "Everyone in that room." Eli turned from the window and looked at Cole directly. "Good," he said, and there was nothing childish in the word. It was the sound of someone who had carried a truth alone for years and had finally been allowed to set it down in public. Marcus pulled into the Beacon Hill driveway and killed the engine and sat for a moment before getting out, which was not something Marcus did. Cole noticed. From the front seat, without turning, Marcus said, his voice rough at the edges in a way it almost never was, "I just want to say," he stopped, started again. "I watched you walk out of that courthouse holding that boy's hand and He stopped again. He cleared his throat. He said, "Daniel would have been real proud of you." Then he opened his door and got out before either of them could respond. Cole sat very still in the back seat. Eli looked at him. Cole's jaw was tight and his eyes were wet at the corners, and he was very clearly not going to say anything for a moment. Eli reached over and put his hand on Cole's arm, just briefly, the same way Cole had laid his hand on the back of Eli's neck that morning. Present, no pressure, then released. "You okay?" Eli said. Cole let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go inside." Mrs. Garland had made dinner. Real dinner, the kind that required actual effort. A roast with potatoes, bread still warm from the oven, the kitchen smelling like a home in a way it hadn't in years. She stood at the stove when they came in, and she turned around and looked at Eli, and her face did something she clearly hadn't intended it to do in front of anyone. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for 1 second. Then she straightened and said briskly, in the tone of a woman who had decided she was done being emotional, "Dinner in 20 minutes. Wash your hands." Eli said, "Yes, ma'am," and went upstairs. And the moment he was gone, Mrs. Garland looked at Cole and said, "Is it done?" Cole said, "It's done." She nodded once, turned back to the stove and said, to the pot in front of her, "Good. About time." The first weeks after the hearing had a quality that Cole hadn't expected and couldn't have prepared for. Not ease exactly, not the clean resolution of a story that had tied itself off neatly, but something more honest than that. Growth, which is always somewhat uncomfortable, always slightly uneven, always a little louder and more chaotic than the version you imagined. Eli had nightmares twice in the first week. Both times Cole was in the hallway before the sound had fully formed. Both times he sat in the chair by the window and stayed until the boy's breathing steadied, and then stayed a little longer, because he wanted to, not because he had to. The third week passed without a nightmare. The fourth week, Eli slept with his door fully open for the first time, and the green backpack stayed in the closet rather than beside the bed. And when Cole noticed, he didn't say anything about it, but something settled in his chest with a quiet finality that felt like a long-held note finally resolving. The compass moved to the windowsill, open, catching the morning light. Eli never explained why he moved it. Cole understood anyway. Mara came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, then just Thursdays, then once a week, then once every 2 weeks. At their last session, she sat across from Eli while he beat her at a game of cards for the fourth consecutive time. And afterward, she told Cole in the hallway, "He's going to be fine. Not fixed. Fine is different from fixed," she said. "Fine means he carries what happened to him, and it doesn't stop him." She looked at Cole. "That goes for both of you." Cole said, "Is that your clinical opinion?" She smiled. "That's my personal one," she said. "The clinical one costs more." Arthur came by on a Thursday afternoon in March with a folder and a measured expression, and Cole felt the familiar bracing in his chest before a word was said. He sat down and said, "The district attorney's office has formally charged Diane Calloway. Fraud, child neglect, financial exploitation. Ruth Elms has agreed to full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges." He set the folder on the desk and leaned back. "It's going to trial in the fall." Cole said, "Does Eli need to testify?" Arthur said, "Margaret is working to avoid it. She thinks the documentary evidence is sufficient, but I wanted you prepared in case." Cole nodded. Then he said, "And the money?" Arthur permitted himself a brief, dry satisfaction. "The trust fund has been fully transferred to Eli's name, with interest, 4 years of monthly payments, recalculated from the date of original placement." He slid a single page forward. "Eli Ward is not a poor young man." Cole looked at the number. He slid the page back. "Don't tell him yet." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "He's 9 years old," Cole said. "He needs a childhood first. The money can wait until he's ready to understand it." Arthur took the page back. He said, "As you wish." And then more quietly, "That's a good call, Cole." Cole said nothing, but he held it. 6 months after the hearing, on a Saturday in September, Cole took Eli to a quiet cemetery outside the city. It was Eli's idea. He had asked 2 weeks earlier at the chessboard, with the directness that had become one of the things Cole loved most about him. Not the careful, measured speech of a child managing an adult's emotions, but the straight, clean ask of someone who trusted that the answer would be honest. "Can we go see him?" Eli had said. Cole had looked at him. "You want to?" Eli said. "He's your son. I want to know where he is." They went on a Saturday morning when the sky was high and pale blue, and the grass was still holding the last of the summer green. Cole drove. Eli sat in the passenger seat with the window down and the compass in his palm, not fidgeting with it, just holding it, the way you hold something that belongs to the place you're going. They stood at the grave together. Daniel Thomas Hargrove, 6 years old. Cole stood with his hands at his sides and breathed, and did not say anything for a long moment. Eli stepped forward and crouched down and placed the compass carefully on the base of the stone. He stayed crouched there for a moment, his head slightly bowed, and then he said, quietly, to the stone, "Hey, I'm Eli. I live with your dad now. He takes care of me." He paused. "He's pretty great at it." He stood back up. "I thought you should know." Cole's chest cracked open in a way that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with something far more complicated and full. He put his arm around Eli's shoulders, and the boy leaned into him, and they stood there together in the September morning in front of that small stone, and Cole said quietly, "I couldn't save you, but I found him." He looked down at the boy beside him. "I think you would have liked each other." Eli said quietly, "I think so too." Then he reached up and put his hand over Cole's hand on his shoulder and left it there. They stayed longer than was necessary. Neither of them was in a hurry. On the drive home, Eli was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I left him the compass." Cole kept his eyes on the road. "I know. Does that bother you?" Eli asked. Cole thought about it. "No," he said. "I think he would have liked having it." Eli leaned his head against the window. He used to like things like that, didn't he? The toy cars, the specific order. "Yeah," Cole said. "He was very particular." Eli almost smiled. "I'm like that about my chess pieces." Cole glanced at him. "I've noticed." They drove the rest of the way home in a silence that was entirely comfortable, entirely warm, the particular silence of two people who have passed through something together and come out on the other side still standing, still holding on. 8 years later, the Whitmore Family Foster Center no longer existed by that name or in that building. In its place stood the Hargrove Family Center, 3 stories of warm brick and wide windows, the hallways lined with murals painted by children's hands in colors that had nothing to do with institutional beige, and a new sign above the entrance that caught the morning light on clear days and was visible from the street a block away. Cole had funded every dollar of the reconstruction. Not for his name on the sign. Arthur had actually argued against putting his name on it, citing optics, and Cole had overruled him for the only reason that mattered. So the children inside knew that someone saw them. That someone stopped. Eli was 17. He stood 6 feet tall with the broad-shouldered build of someone who had been well-fed and well-loved for the better part of a decade. And he moved with the easy confidence of a person who had learned that the world was not primarily a threat to be managed. His gray eyes still missed nothing. But now what they recorded was different. Not exits and escape routes, but people, faces, the specific quality of someone who was being passed over and hadn't yet made peace with it. He came to the Meet and Connect evening because Cole was coming, and because Eli had not missed one since he was 12 years old, and had started to understand what these evenings meant, what they had meant to him, what they still meant to the children standing on the yellow strips of tape on the floor. The hall was full. Families moved through it with the same patterns they always moved through, gravitating toward the children who made eye contact easily, who smiled readily, who carried themselves in ways that signaled they would be uncomplicated. The same gravitational pull, the same invisible sorting. Some things changed slowly. Eli was standing near the refreshments table when he saw the boy. He was in the far corner of the hall, 8 years old, maybe 9, brown hair over his forehead, clothes slightly too large, the way donated clothes always were. His shoulders were curved inward so precisely that Eli felt the physical memory of it in his own body before his mind had fully registered what he was looking at. The boy's eyes tracked the room in slow intervals. Door, window, the table with the cookies he had not gone near, and family after family drifted past him without stopping. Eli set down his cup. He crossed the room without hurrying, moving past the bright conversations and the careful negotiations between families and children who were going home tonight, moving directly toward the far corner and the boy who was not. He stopped in front of him. The boy looked up. His eyes were wary and measuring and already resigned, the expression of a child who has decided that preemptive indifference hurts less than hope. Eli crouched down until his eyes were level with the boy's. He said, "Hi." The boy said nothing. Eli said, "I know what this feels like." He said it simply, without performance, the way you say something that is simply true. Standing here, watching everyone else, thinking maybe there's something wrong with you that you can't see, but everyone else can. He paused. "I stood where you're standing, on a tape strip just like that one, and I thought the same thing." The boy's eyes shifted. Something in them moved, not trust yet, not hope yet, but something one step before both of those things. Attention. Real attention, the kind that hadn't been offered to him tonight by anyone else. Eli said, "Your name." A long pause, then barely audible. "Owen." Eli said, "I'm Eli." He held out his hand. Owen looked at it for a moment, then he shook it, with the solemn gravity of a child taking something seriously because no one has taught him that some things can be taken lightly. Eli looked back over his shoulder. Cole stood 15 feet away. He had not followed. He had not intervened. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and his ice-blue eyes on his son, and his face was doing something that only happened when he was not managing it. Open, unguarded, full in a way that had taken years to reach. Eli looked at him and said quietly across the distance, "Dad." Cole took one step forward. Eli said, "Can we?" Cole crossed the room and crouched beside his son in front of the boy in the too large clothes. He looked at Owen. Owen looked at him with the measuring gray wariness of a child who has learned not to expect and was currently in the process of revising that lesson in real time. Cole said quietly, "Nobody should have to stand in a corner alone." Owen looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Eli. Then he looked at the floor. Then he said very quietly, "Nobody ever picks me." Cole looked at his son. Eli looked at his father. Something passed between them. 8 years of early mornings and nightmares and chess games, and one compass placed on a small grave on a September day, and 1,000 ordinary moments that had built, piece by piece, into something unbreakable. Cole looked back at Owen. He said, "We do." The house in Beacon Hill filled the way houses fill when they are finally used for what houses are for. Completely, loudly, imperfectly, with the specific, beautiful chaos of people who belong to each other. Two voices called for Cole from different floors at different volumes on different topics, frequently simultaneously. Arguments about the remote and whose turn it was to load the dishwasher, and whether Eli had actually won the last chess game fairly, a charge Eli refuted every single time with great conviction and zero credibility. Toy cars on the shelf in a room that was no longer closed. Mrs. Garland, who had doubled her baking output without being asked and without acknowledging that she had. Marcus, who had claimed the armchair in the corner of the living room as his own and occupied it on most evenings without invitation and without anyone suggesting he stop. Mara came for dinner on the first Sunday of every month. Arthur came on Wednesdays. The house had a rhythm now, the particular rhythm of a place that is genuinely inhabited, where the furniture gets moved and the rugs get worn and the kitchen is never entirely clean. One evening in October, Cole stood at the window looking out over Boston, the way he had looked out over it his whole adult life. His city, his empire, still present, still his, still the place where his name meant something serious in certain rooms. But it was no longer the primary thing. It had not been the primary thing for 8 years. Behind him, his sons were arguing about something that didn't matter and mattered completely. The way things do when you are loved enough to fight about small things without fear. Cole listened to the sound of it, the overlapping voices, the indignation, the laughter that broke through the indignation. Eli's voice dropping into the patient, older brother register he'd developed with Owen, and that still surprised Cole with its certainty. And he thought about a November night 8 years ago when he had stood in the back of a foster center hall and heard a boy whisper something to no one and had crossed a room and knelt on a cold floor and said 7 words. He thought about a small hand on a compass placed at the base of a stone. He thought about a boy who had slept in a closet and hidden bread in a backpack and learned to fold himself into corners because corners were the only safe thing, and who now stood 6 feet tall and crossed rooms with intention and looked at frightened children with the direct, clear gaze of someone who had been there and come back and knew exactly what to say. He thought about Daniel, and he did not flinch. Behind him, Owen said, loudly and with conviction, "Eli cheated." Eli said, "I absolutely did not." Cole said without turning, "Eli." Eli said, "Fine, maybe a little." Cole turned from the window and looked at his sons. Both of them looked back at him. Eli with the particular expression of someone caught, but only slightly apologetic. Owen with the bright-eyed vindication of a younger sibling who has just been validated. Cole said, Rematch. Tomorrow, both of you. Owen said, he'll cheat again. Eli said, I'll cheat less. Cole looked at them. These two boys who had stood in corners in a foster center hall and been invisible and were now here, in this house, in this noise, in this life. And he felt the full weight of it, not as grief this time, not as guilt, not as the hollow ache of everything he had lost, but as something else entirely, something whole. He was still Hargrove. He was still the man Boston's underworld did not cross. He was still the man who had built something out of nothing, through will and precision, and the particular cold clarity of someone who understood how the world actually worked beneath its polished surface. But first, before the empire, under the empire, the thing the empire was built around now, he was a father. And the greatest thing Cole Hargrove ever built was not a business empire or a reputation or an untouchable name. It was the answer he gave when a child whispered into an empty room that nobody ever chose him. The answer was simple. The answer was everything. The porch light at the Hargrove house stayed on every night, not because anyone was afraid of the dark, but because in this house, the dark was no longer something anyone had to face alone. And that, in the end, was the only thing that had ever mattered.